Greetings. This is Chris Avila. I am the Director of the Waco Metropolitan Planning Organization, and I'd like to welcome you to this presentation on Connections 2045, the Waco Metropolitan Transportation Plan. So before we get into the deep dive on the plan itself, we'd like to cover a little bit about what is the Metropolitan Planning Organization and why we are here. Kind of go through the process for a project going from concept to reality. Then we'll start looking at some trends, issues, future challenges that we see on the horizon. And then do a review of the draft recommendations that the staff have come up with. Kind of go through an adoption timeline. And then tell you how you can give us input on what you think are the most important priorities for the region. And if there's anything missing here, run through how you can give us some feedback about what you think ought to be in this plan, or maybe what ought not be in this plan. So the Metropolitan Planning Organization is a federally funded program designed to give long-term input into regional transportation decisions. It gives priority recommendations on significant projects, and we're here to give a realistic discussion on funding and how we can actually move projects forward into reality. If we're going to be using federal highway or transit funds for anything within our region, those projects actually have to be physically located within this transportation plan. And we also work with a number of local governments on important priorities for their region. And this plan is designed to look at how do we combine all of those to fit into a cohesive plan for the future and identify how all those projects work together towards a common goal. Metropolitan planning organizations are required for all urbanized areas that have more than 50,000 people. For the Waco MPO, that happens to be McLennan County, and that is our area of jurisdiction. We are governed by a 20-member policy board, which includes staff and elected officials from many of our member governments, including the City of Waco, cities of Belmead, Hewitt, Woodway, Lacey, Lakeview, and Robinson, as well as the City of McGregor. We also have representation from McLennan County and the Texas Department of Transportation. The policy board is then advised by a 36-member technical committee, which includes professional staff, including engineers, planners, and various modal interests such as Waco Transit and the Waco Regional Airport. The primary role of the MPO is to provide coordination and consensus building to identify what the most important transportation priorities are within the region and how to fund the most important transportation projects. Now, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan not only identifies regional transportation goals, but also identifies those projects that are to be implemented in the next 25 years. It is also supposed to include a lot more than just highways and public transportation. It's supposed to look at all modes of transportation, including aviation, rail, or maybe some new things that are going to come along, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. And as I mentioned before, if we're using federal highway or public transportation dollars, those projects must be specifically identified in this plan. The most important part of this, however, is that our transportation plan, as all MPO documents are required to be constrained against a realistic estimate of future revenues. And we'll be going through that in a little bit in a couple of future slides. Now, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan is one part of a process that the transportation planning process follows. It begins with the collection of what we call a universe of projects, where we ask citizens, a number of stakeholder interests, such as Transit and TxDOT and our local cities and counties, as well as other professional staff to identify what are the most important issues and concerns of the region. From there, we will get a list of candidate projects that the MPO staff will evaluate against several different factors, things such as traffic flow, safety data, condition of the roadway, and we'll look at all those factors and try to come up with a scoring system to identify what are the projects that best address some of the concerns that have been voiced. Those projects, provided that there are sufficient funds within the next 25 years to build those projects, or in the case of transit, to implement the project, those will make their way into the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. From there, we will then have a shorter range, 10-year plan to identify which projects need to move to some phase of implementation. Usually design or engineering, maybe acquiring right-of-way or perhaps utility relocation if appropriate. Once a project is deemed ready, ready for construction or otherwise implementation, and we have an entity that's committing funding to the project, then we can start talking about our 4-year transportation improvement program. That's very similar to a capital improvement program that many of our local municipalities and counties will have for their capital programs. Once a project is in the TIP, then we can start talking about implementation and what year it will be ready for construction or service initiation. So, diving into the transportation plan, this MTP has 6 overarching guiding principles that the MPO Policy Board identified as important for this plan to try to obtain. It ranges anywhere from maintaining the existing roadway network to improving safety and security of the system, maximizing use of what we already have before we start looking at very expensive expansion projects. Air quality and the environment are also important principles that we aspire to. We also want to support our regional economic development efforts and the movement of freight, not only through our region, but into and out of our region. And then we want to ensure that we have good access to opportunities and essential services for all citizens within our region. So let's look at some trends and issues that we've taken a look at and may influence how we get from point A to point B in the future. So the first item is population. We have a map right now that looks at population change to the year 2045. The reds and purples on this map represent the areas of highest growth, and the blues to maybe even some grays represent either very modest or no growth to even perhaps a slight decline by the year 2045. Where we see the most growth in the next 25 years is in suburban areas, most notably the Woodway to Hewitt corridor and maybe a little bit further south and west of there in places like McGregor or Lorena. China Spring continues to be forecasted as a growth area. We also see some growth in the Robinson area and to a lesser extent the Axtell area. And then finally, we do expect some infill growth into the urban core. This is consistent with forecasts that the City of Waco identified within their city plan. If population is our point A, then employment is our point B. And so when we look at where future employment will be concentrated, we're looking at a lot of growth in the Loop 340 corridor, or Woodway to Hewitt corridor, but we're also looking at quite a bit of growth out towards McGregor as part of their efforts to promote their industrial park. We see some growth also out towards China Spring, and to a lesser extent in the area around Loop 340 and I-35 around Belmead and Lacey Lakeview. We also see some growth in employment in the Robinson area, and these are all consistent with the concept that employment generally follows population growth. We do, however, also see some limited growth in the urban core as well. And since 2015, we've seen some of that already up until today. So obviously, population and employment then influence traffic volumes. In 2015, we did see some spot areas of challenge, especially in our suburban areas. But when we look at the urban core, we see a lot of what we would consider good conditions. But we also see what we would characterize as underutilized conditions, where we have more capacity than the traffic volume would otherwise dictate. Fast forward to the year 2040, and now most roadways in our suburban areas are having issues. When we look at the center of the urban core, downtown Waco, East Waco, North Waco, we still see a lot of good conditions, and we even see a number of corridors that would be characterized as being underutilized. These are conditions that we want to take a close look at to see if we've got more capacity than we really need, and are there opportunities perhaps to right-size those corridors to allow us to accommodate other modes of transportation, such as bicycles, pedestrians, public transportation. And also we want to take a look at the opportunities maybe to reduce the amount of pavement or bridge structures that we're maintaining, since those budgets are already stretched pretty thin. And so if we have an opportunity to remove some facilities or downsize some facilities, that helps make those budgets go a little bit further. Freight movement is also an area that we've taken a close look at. The state of Texas has identified a number of networks or number of roadways within our region that are important to the flow of freight from a statewide perspective, Interstate 35 being the most important of those. But you can see here the corridors identified in green are also important from a statewide perspective. Now, our interest is in identifying facilities that then can connect important freight generators within our region to the state network. Those are outlined in purple. In those corridors, we're looking at to make sure that they meet minimum requirements for accommodating heavy trucks. Then we have to look at the question of automated vehicles and how they might change how we get from point A to point B. And are there special infrastructure needs associated with those vehicles? The good news is that, at least in the short term, there doesn't appear to be any new challenges associated in terms of new infrastructure types to accommodate automated vehicles. And so a lot of our focus in the short term, at least within the next 10 years, is going to be maintaining the existing system in good condition. These vehicles are sensitive to poor pavements, poor signage, poor lane markings, and poor traffic signals. And so we'll be focusing some efforts to improve those for the upcoming automation period. So when we look at long term, however, we're looking at the possibility that these vehicles may fundamentally change how we get from point A to point B. Some of what we're concerned about is how these vehicles interact with vehicles that are not automated. We're also interested in whether there will be an increase in travel as a result of people being able to use vehicles and not having to be actively engaged in operating the vehicle. We're also interested in passenger pickup and drop-off zones, where vehicles might park and where they might recharge, since many of these vehicles are anticipated to be electric vehicles. And then what is the long-term impact to public transportation? These are not questions that we have definitive answers at this time, but we imagine that this is going to become much clearer within the next 5 years. And so the recommendation is to keep an eye on the progress of the technology and to begin having those conversations at a local level to see which of these conditions may be more of a concern and what kind of planning our local cities and counties can perform to perhaps avoid some of the more concerning of the impacts while promoting some of the more beneficial impacts, such as the anticipated improvement in safety that's we're expecting. For pavement condition, the good news is that the state system is actually in relatively good pavement condition. Less than 10% of the overall system is identified as having a poor roughness index. When we get off of that system, however, it's not as good. And while this shows the city of Waco system, we also know that pretty much the rest of the system, regardless of what city, regardless of whether it's a county-maintained facility, is not much better. And so we know that we have some challenges with regards to pavement condition once we get off of the state highway system. One area of good news is that bridge ratings are generally pretty good in McLennan County, and there are only a handful of bridges that would be considered structurally deficient. But the good news is that most bridges are structurally fine. Looking at crashes, the one thing we can say is that there are far too many. There are over 18,000 crashes between 2016 and 2018. 107 people lost their lives in a traffic crash. And there are over 570 serious injuries, or what we would call life-threatening injuries, during that same period of time. The challenge is that most of those crashes were the result of some driver error. The 4 primary driver errors that were observed within McLennan County involved speed or excessive speed, someone running a red light or a stop sign, distracted driving, and while the influence of alcohol or drugs was a small percentage in terms of the total overall number, it was a very significant percentage of fatal and serious injury crashes. And so that remains a point of concern for our region. And when we look at where those crashes are physically located, what's concerning is that they're pretty much everywhere. However, there are certain concentrations along certain corridors and at certain intersections, and that's where this plan has focused some of their efforts to try to see if there is a design effort that can help move us in the right direction in terms of reducing the total number of crashes that we're seeing. Another challenge that we have to acknowledge is that we have far too many people within our region living at or below the census-defined poverty level. It's about 1 in 5 individuals. It's also the folks who are making between 100 and 200% of that poverty level. These are the folks that are one economic crisis away from being in poverty. And that's almost 1 out of 4 McLennan County residents. So there's only slightly more than half of the population that would be characterized as being economically okay. And so we'd like to do something collectively as a region to try to make those numbers both a little bit smaller. For us, transportation has been identified as a barrier to those efforts. The reason for that is that if you look at where the core of the poverty is, basically concentrated in East Waco, North Waco, Belmead, and to a lesser extent South Waco, it's physically located in a different place than where a lot of our employment is. In fact, nearly half of all employment within McLennan County is located in the circle identified on this map as the core of total employment. Public transportation is used quite heavily by those who live below a certain economic means. And unfortunately, the current system is not very well set up to make that connection. Right now, that star in the middle of this map represents where virtually all transit trips must make a transfer, especially if you're trying to get from the north or side of our region, or East Waco, and you're trying to get down to where the core of the total employment is. So this is one of the things that the plan has looked at to try to make some headway on. The reason this is important is that when we take out rent or housing costs, we take out child care costs, and then we take out transportation costs, there's very little left over at the end of the day for everything else. That includes food, health care, clothing, utilities, everything else in life. There are assistance programs for rent and for child care, but there's not an assistance program to allow folks to own an automobile. If we can make public transportation work better, while it's not the entire equation to getting people out of poverty, it does make a significant difference. It actually results in about a $4,000 a year savings for folks on their transportation budget. And it does help in terms of helping folks get ahead. But we have to make transit a viable transportation option. We don't expect people to drive to the bus. Most people will either walk or ride a bicycle to catch the bus. In addition, we have a number of trips within our region that are made by automobile that are less than a mile in length. These are not necessarily the most efficient ways of making those trips, but we don't have a lot of infrastructure to support either the bicycle or the pedestrian modes. Here you can see that we have less than 30 miles total of bicycle facilities within the region as of 2019. And as a result, only a very small number of people actually use a bicycle as their way of getting to and from work or school. For the pedestrian mode, while we do have some sidewalk coverage within downtown Waco, and now starting to see more coverage in some outer suburban areas due to requirements that the city of Waco has for new subdivisions, we still see a lot of areas, a lot of very densely populated areas that have few, if any, sidewalks at all. In addition, more than half, or almost half, of the sidewalks within the region are either in a poor or fair condition, meaning it's either difficult or impossible for you to get a wheelchair down the sidewalk. As a result, less than 2% of Wacoans commute to work or school using walking as a method. And not only is this important for public transportation and making that a viable option, this is also important for air quality purposes. The good news is that the Waco region has seen our trend of air quality going in the right direction in the last several years. We've seen a very significant drop in ozone values, which is typical for a lot of other regions across the country, as automobiles become more efficient and cleaner. Our concern is the last few years we've seen a small uptick. And on this slide, where we want to be is below the yellow line. Right now we're significantly below that. We want to stay there because to get above the yellow line means a possible designation as non-attainment by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Non-attainment status comes with a lot of things that we'd like to try to avoid, including limitations on what kind of industries and businesses we can bring to our region. It also means restrictions on vehicles and how they operate, and sometimes what types of fuels they can use. For our region, we feel it's a lot better if we can stay out of that non-attainment designation. Not to mention, attainment areas are generally healthier, and folks who have some type of respiratory or cardiovascular issue, it's a much better environment for them as well. We also need to talk about the concept of micromobility. You may have seen scooters or e-bikes that have proliferated in other communities in response to a market demand for some of these shorter trips. And Waco will likely see a pilot program for some type of micromobility project within the very short, near future. Will they look like scooters? We're not sure. They may be something very different from what we see now, but the market is there, and we recognize that we need to provide for that market. Now let's shift gears into looking at what we see as how we're going to meet those challenges of the future. This past spring, we asked Waco citizens to give us some input into what they see as the most important regional priorities in terms of projects. We had over 400 different projects submitted to us, costing nearly $4 billion when we add it all up together. Now, we still have question marks under the other category because there is one other mode that is still evolving, and that is the question of passenger rail. And that is something that we are also receiving feedback on as we speak. We have a separate presentation that you may download regarding high-speed passenger transportation. That is a separate study being conducted by AECOM, and they are making certain recommendations, and we'd like some feedback from you, if you have the time, to let us know whether you feel that their recommendations are valid for our region and what direction you feel Waco should pursue in terms of high-speed transportation. But what exactly that looks like is still evolving, and so we still don't know what exactly that looks like or how much that is going to cost. And so that is still a question mark as we speak today. So if we're trying to come up with $4 billion, we need to identify where that money is going to come from. If we look at the baseline, or making no changes to our revenue structure as it exists today, then we pretty much only have enough money to maintain what we've got. However, we anticipate that the revenue will probably change a little bit for the positive in the future. The scenario that we've identified as adopted is what we feel is a realistic scenario of how much our region can expect for the next 25 years. But we didn't stop there. We wanted to see what would it take to actually fund $4 billion worth of improvements. The high enhancement scenario attempts to accomplish that. However, we termed that the unicorn scenario, mainly because it has no basis in reality. It is a very aggressive scenario, just about every revenue enhancement you can imagine, including a number of scenarios where Texans have never supported in the past. The important point of that is to say that we still failed at generating $4 billion worth of revenue, even under the high enhancement scenario. And so we would like to propose that we probably need to start rethinking how we get from point A to point B, because there's no realistic scenario that we can follow to actually accomplish what folks told us they felt was important. And so while we will be making some project recommendations today, we would like to take this opportunity to have begin a conversation about transportation in the future. Now, there's a public transportation component to this as well, and it, like the highways, is very similar. We went through a high enhancement exercise here as well, and likewise, it also falls a little bit short of identifying everything that folks asked us to look at over the next 25 years. So since we don't have enough money to do everything, we need to have a process to prioritize what we were asked to look at. And so the MPO staff developed a project evaluation criteria where each project is scored based on how well, or perhaps how unwell, they accomplish the 6 guiding principles that we identified earlier. But life is not easy, and we do have some projects that didn't score well, but were still identified as high priorities, either by MPO staff or by one or multiple members of our MPO policy board. Likewise, we also have projects that scored very, very well, but we weren't comfortable making a recommendation on them at this time because we're not sure that they necessarily have the necessary amount of public support. And we'll go through those in a couple of slides a little later on to identify what we think the appropriate strategies are for those projects moving forward. This slide basically goes through the process that we use to identify where there might be appropriate exceptions. And in each case, we went through an exercise to assess why an exception might be appropriate and also to identify whether the project is still viable. And then finally, before we get to the recommendations themselves, there's one final requirement that we have to identify. The MPO, under state law, does have to identify a 10-year plan of projects. And this is basically to ensure that implementing agencies, such as the Texas Department of Transportation, or Waco Transit, City Waco, or McLean County, or any one of our other implementing agencies, are following the priorities identified within this short-range plan. So the projects identified in this plan that are identified as short-term, covering the year from 2020 to 2030, those are identified to meet this requirement. Now, projects that are identified as long-term priorities can still be developed by our various implementing agencies, but they will require concurrence with the MPO Policy Board at some later time to determine whether they are important enough to begin the process of identifying an appropriate funding strategy and moving to construction in a shorter time frame. All right, so with that, let's move into the project recommendations themselves. So all the project recommendations are categorized into one of 6 strategies, which correspond to one of the guiding principles we identified earlier. The first strategy is improving the state of good repair, and this ties back to satisfactorily maintaining existing facilities. And as you can imagine, some of the factors that were important for these projects were the condition of pavements and bridges, sidewalks, and transit facilities or transit buses. The very first recommendation is a categorical project, and this covers routine maintenance and rehabilitation that all agencies that own a portion of our highway system undergo. And the important point to look at here is that this categorical project represents almost half of the entire expenditure for the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. There is also a preventive maintenance and rehabilitation category for public transportation, and as you can imagine, it covers a sizable chunk of what Waco Transit spends for their system over the next 25 years. There are several projects here that are standalone and look at significant reconstruction efforts that we feel will be necessary during the next 25 years. On this map, the projects identified in red are short-term through the year 2030. The green projects represent long-term recommendations through the year 2045. The number one priority in this strategy is a reconstruction of Spring Valley Road in the Hewitt area. This would also add a center turn lane, would reconstruct a loft cross drainage, provide shoulders, and also identify some bicycle and pedestrian improvements, especially in the vicinity of the Spring Valley Elementary School. The second priority is a reconstruction of 17th Street in downtown Waco, and also taking the 17th and 18th Street corridor and right-sizing that project to accommodate other modes of transportation. The third priority is a full reconstruction of Mars Drive to also include the construction of a center turn lane and better bicycle and pedestrian connections to the Midway ISD complex. Shifting gears to long-range projects, the number 4 is the reconstruction and replacement of the Lake Waco bridges for State Highway 6, reconstruction of bridges on Highway 6 at Bosque Boulevard, Sanger Avenue, and Waco Drive, the upper-level bridge. And also, as part of Priority 5, is providing bicycle and pedestrian improvements for the Sanger Avenue Bridge. Priority 6 is a reconstruction of Old McGregor Road in Woodway. And Priority 7 is a rehabilitation of the Waco Transit Intermodal Center, which by the year 2030 will be 30 years old and will be needing some upgrades at that point. Strategy 2 is improving safety and security for the region, which ties back to the guiding principle that is also to improve safety and security of the system. Primary factors here, we're looking at crash numbers, but also the effectiveness of various scopes of work in reducing crashes. We do have a categorical project for safety and security, and this is a very small project, but it covers routine elements, things like replacing guardrails or lighting or safety treating fixed objects. The most important projects here were identified for the Highway 31 corridor heading out towards Corsicana. The interchanges at TK Parkway, or FM 939, and FM 2311 have some really bad crashes with really bad outcomes. While the total number is not large, when a crash does occur, it's usually unacceptably bad, and the proposed scope of work is very effective at reducing those crashes. The scope of work would be to build overpasses at each intersection. The third most important project here is in the Belmead area on North Loop 340. There's a lot of bicycle and pedestrian crossings taking place, especially in the vicinity of the La Vega High School, but there are very few traffic controls on this section of roadway. Our recommendation is to at least put 2 intersections here with full signals and some improvements to make it a little bit easier to be able to walk or ride a bicycle across the facility. And then it also includes a full sidewalk connecting the La Vega High School over to Interstate 35. The fourth priority is US 84 in the Woodway area. This is a ramp reversal project designed to provide more storage for traffic onto the frontage road, which right now the off-ramps are a little bit too close to the intersections, which means that during peak periods traffic is backing up onto the main lanes, and it is a risk not only for rear-end collisions, but also does slow down main lane traffic quite considerably. The fifth priority here is a long-term priority and would be a pedestrian overpass in the Belmead area in the vicinity of the Walmart. This is over Interstate 35, and this project was identified as being important because of the number of fatal pedestrian crashes occurring on the main lanes of Interstate 35. And there's a lot of demand to get across the interstate here, but it's a very long distance for folks to get either from Lakeshore Drive or Barron Circle up to the Walmart. This would greatly reduce that distance. But one of the challenges we have is that in order to meet ADA compliance, the ramp work would be quite long. And so to overcome that, we would be recommending the installation of elevators at this pedestrian overpass. Now, one of the challenges with that is that it does add an operational element or operational cost that we then have to work to identify who would be paying for that, which thus makes this a long-term strategy rather than a more shorter-term strategy. Strategy 3 is about system efficiency. This is where we're looking at those facilities that were identified as underutilized in earlier slides showing traffic conditions. Not only are we looking at what's being underutilized today, but does that condition still exist in the year 2040 or the year 2045? And does this give us an opportunity perhaps to reduce the pavement footprint and reduce the number of bridges we have to maintain, but also give us some opportunities to better accommodate other modes of transportation within the corridor. So the first priority here is Washington Avenue, converting that from one-way to two-way. That project is very close to being implemented, and this is a carryover project from the previous plan. The second most important priority, however, is Potts Interchange. This is at US 84 and US Business 77. It's a three-level interchange that was built in the 1940s and is now starting to show its age. The middle level bridge is now officially structurally deficient, still safe, but not ideal. The upper level bridge is also not ideal, and we know that at some point we're going to have to do something about those bridges. The recommendation of a corridor study performed by the MPO a couple of years ago was, rather than rebuild these bridges as they are underutilized, it would be better to bring everything back down to grade, reconstructing Business 77 as a boulevard without the frontage roads, and then at key intersections, such as Potts Interchange, the installation of a roundabout, which doesn't require a signal, which doesn't require signal maintenance, and then the anticipated traffic volumes are low enough that each of these intersections should operate sufficiently as a roundabout. Priorities 3, 4, and 5 are all similar recommendations to Priority 2, and all those came from the same corridor study. Priority 3, however, also adds a continuation of Loop 574, or Martin Luther King Boulevard, from where it currently ends at LaSalle Avenue to tie into Marlin Highway and eventually Highway 6. This would complete the Business 6 concept of bringing a better connection into downtown Waco from the south and east. Strategy 4 involves livability. One of the more important concepts here is preserving regional air quality and environmental standards, and so a lot of the recommendations here involve non-automotive modes. It also involves supporting existing development rather than greenfield development. So we have a categorical project here as well to cover bicycle and pedestrian improvements. This is a pretty small amount, but this is for projects in the vicinity of, say, schools or parks that might be very small projects that don't necessarily rise to the level typically found by projects within the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. When we look at the specific projects within the recommendations, the top priority here is a redesign of 18th and 19th Street out towards the McLennan Community College. Right now it's a 4-lane roadway with a center turn lane. The lanes themselves are somewhat narrow, but the corridor study that was done by the City of Waco identified this as an opportunity to right-size the project and provide better bicycle and pedestrian transit connections along the corridor. The second priority involves LaSalle Avenue. This is a 6-lane corridor. However, the traffic volumes really would be more supportive of 4 lanes. By narrowing the number of travel lanes, this provides opportunities to not only provide for bicycles and pedestrians along the corridor and better transit connections, but also to make the corridor more aesthetically appropriate for the transitioning land uses along the corridor. Number 3 is a conversion of Franklin Avenue from one-way to two-way, similar to Washington Avenue. Fourth most important project here is University Parks Drive, which would be a very similar project to the LaSalle Avenue project. Again, we have 6 lanes through the Baylor campus. The traffic volumes are probably more appropriate for a 4-lane facility. And again, this gives us a better opportunity to incorporate bicycle, pedestrian, public transportation modes along that corridor. Priority 5 and 6 are linked together. Priority 5 is actually the construction of a standalone bicycle and pedestrian trail called the Katy Trail, which would extend through a portion of East Waco. Project 6 would then take those improvements and follow Dallas Street to connect the Katy Trail to the Elm Avenue corridor. And right now we have a project for the Elm Avenue corridor that will be getting started very shortly to provide for a good bicycle and pedestrian connection along that facility, along with streetscape improvements. So now transitioning over to the long-term projects, number 7 is 26th Street, providing a continuous sidewalk along that corridor. Number 8 is Sanger Avenue, which would be a road diet project. Again, right-sizing the facility, which right now we have 4 lanes but no turn lane. And as a result, we're seeing a lot of rear-end collisions along that corridor. This would narrow the number of lanes down to one lane in each direction, but provide for a turn lane, and then we would have enough pavement width to provide for bike lanes along the corridor. This project also recommends a continuous sidewalk along Sanger Avenue as well. Project 9 is 4th and 5th Streets through downtown Waco and converting those from one-way to two-way. And Priority 10 is Forest Street in East Waco. And with the interstate project that was recently completed, we now have a good pedestrian connection across the interstate that then doesn't connect to anything else. So Project 10 would then connect those improvements to Elm Avenue and providing a good connection across the interstate to the east side of the interstate and the other side of East Waco. Strategy 5 is the mobility strategy. This one is identifying projects for regional freight movement and to help with our economic development efforts. This is all about getting traffic from point A to point B. And these are some of your more typical large capacity expansion projects that plans have focused a lot on in the past. One thing you'll notice when we refer to this map is that there are not a lot of projects on this map. Large-scale mobility projects are generally very expensive, and with funding being very, very limited and becoming more limited over time, we're not able to do as many of these projects as we have been in the past. Let's look at the very first priority on here, and that is what we refer to as the mall-to-mall project. This is a frontage road project along Loop 340 in West Waco between Interstate 35 and US 84, basically connecting Richland Mall to Central Texas Marketplace. In addition to making the frontage roads continuous, it would be realigning the on and off ramps here so that the operations of the facility are more efficient. It would also construct Texas turnarounds at key locations, such as at Bagby Avenue and also in front of Richland Mall. The second priority, along with priorities 3 and 9, all involve the last phase of the expansion and reconstruction of Interstate 35. Priority 2 represents the southbound frontage road and the on and off ramps between Valley Mills Drive and the off ramp to West Loop 340. Because of the way the ramps are aligned in this particular area, it does tend to create a traffic jam, especially in the evening. This project would realign those ramps so that the weaving is taking place on the frontage roads and not the main lanes, and that we can provide an auxiliary lane across the new road bridges to allow for a more efficient merge maneuver in this area, which should help alleviate the traffic jam that we now see at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. This would also replace the main lane bridges over New Road, which right now the vertical clearance underneath is insufficient, and we are seeing occasional bridge strikes from trucks that are trying to access the Flying J truck stop. This is probably about $40 million and is just a fraction of the overall project that had been previously identified for the interstate. Priority 3 is another breakout project from that project, focused on the interchange at Valley Mills Drive and the Interstate 35 frontage roads. This would also construct the northbound frontage road that doesn't currently exist in between Irving Lee and Valley Mills Drive. The remaining parts of the interstate project would then be postponed until sometime after the year 2030, basically following the fiscal realities of that project that have been communicated to us from TxDOT. So that leaves some room for other priorities to move forward in the short term from a fiscal standpoint. Priority 4 is Loop 340 in the Belmead area. That is currently a 2-lane roadway. This would widen it to 4 lanes divided and would then create a continuous 4-lane Loop 340 on the east side of Waco. Since this is the designated alternative for Interstate 35, we feel this is a fairly important priority. The fifth priority is the Franklin New Road interchange and a redesign of Franklin Road up to Lake Air Drive. Priority 6 is Highway 6 out in the Spiegelville area that would extend a 4-lane divided section through the FM 185 interchange. Priority 7 is University Parks Drive from LaSalle Avenue to Garden Drive, widening that to 4 lanes divided from all the new apartment development that has occurred to support Baylor University and Baylor students. And then priority 8 is in the McGregor area, and this one is in the inset map in the upper right-hand corner, and this would be a widening of State Highway 317 south of McGregor to 4 lanes divided, but most importantly, providing a overpass for a proposed railroad spur into the McGregor Industrial Park, which is important for several new tenants into the McGregor Industrial Park. Looking long term, the interstate project becomes the number 9 priority, or the top long-term priority. Priority 10 is a capacity expansion for Spiegelville Road from the Middle Bosque River down to US 84, widening that to 4 lanes divided. Priority 11 is an overpass at Steinbeck Bend Drive and Lakeshore Drive. Priority 12 is the reconstruction of Panther Way between Panther Run and Hewitt Drive to provide for a turn lane and a better bicycle and pedestrian connection to the backside of the Midway School Complex. Priority 13 is at the Marlin Highway and Loop 340 interchange. This would provide an overpass for Loop 340 traffic, so they do not all through traffic would have to go through the existing traffic signal at that interchange. And right now that is the bottleneck for folks using Loop 340 as an alternative to Interstate 35. Priority 14 is Wortham Bend Road in the China Spring area. From China Spring Road northward to McGarry Road, widening that to 4 lanes divided as a result of some of the new subdivision growth in that area. And the final priority here is in the McGregor area. Again, this is in the inset in the upper right-hand corner of the map. This is a southeast bypass of McGregor, again supporting their industrial park, and would provide an alternative for truck traffic especially to access the industrial park without having to go through downtown McGregor, and also providing a way to get across the railroad tracks through McGregor without having to go underneath a bridge on US 84 which has a substandard vertical clearance. This would provide an overpass over those tracks and thus eliminate any issue for oversized or over height loads trying to access the McGregor Industrial Park. We've gone through some details on the interstate project. We want to make sure that folks are aware of this and make sure that we're comfortable with this. So priority number 2 again is the ramp work and southbound frontage road work for the interstate. This represents probably about $40 million worth of work. The intersection at Valley Mills Drive and the interstate frontage roads would be priority number 3. This is about another $40 million worth of work. And then so all the remaining work would be postponed until the year 2030. Priority 6 we want to talk about just briefly here. This is the Highway 6 project in the Spiegelville area. And the reason we want to talk to this is that this was one of the projects that did not score particularly well, but has been identified as an important priority. Part of the reason why it didn't score well, however, is because crashes in the last 3 years have calmed down, which is a good thing, but we do have a history of bad crashes in this particular corridor. And we're concerned that this might have been just a temporary condition, and that we may, without additional work, go back to having a problem in this area. In addition, we also know that this project is not sufficient to address everything traffic-wise through the year 2040, but we still need the capacity. And so we have asked that this project still remain identified as a priority for those 2 reasons. Finally, we get to Strategy 6, which is to provide equal access and benefits. And this is focused on connecting folks to economic opportunities and essential services, especially those who perhaps have limited access to an automobile. This project, while for projects identified within this strategy, do focus a lot of attention on public transportation, and these projects are very effective at accomplishing the guiding principle identified here. The project is still, or these projects are not the only projects within this plan that help this particular guiding principle. In fact, most projects within the MTP do something to improve this condition. Our first recommendation within this strategy is for short-term operations for Waco Transit. And this is to cover things like salaries for bus drivers and making sure that buses have enough fuel and tires and things like that to continue their normal operations. What you'll notice here is we don't identify the long-term operations because that's actually going to be identified as part of one of our standalone projects. The final categorical project here is the ADA paratransit, rural transportation, and elderly and disabled services. And this is a relatively small total, but it's very important for those who need the service. The ADA paratransit service are for those who live within the urbanized area of Waco, but for some physical disability or some other type of disability, they're not able to use the fixed route system. Rural transportation is for those who live outside of the urbanized area but still require public transportation services. And then the elderly and disabled services are available for anyone in McLennan County who meet the qualifications for those services. So there are three recommendations being forwarded here. The first one is the implementation of the bus rapid transit system through Waco, beginning in Belmead and terminating at the Texas Central Industrial Park. In general, the preferred alignment follows Loop 340 down to US 84, down through Taylor Avenue in East Waco, and Franklin Avenue through downtown Waco. Once again, hooking up with Waco Drive when we get out past Valley Mills Drive, and then following US 84 and turning around at the Texas Central Industrial Park, likely either at Texas Central Parkway or, our recommendation, Hewitt Drive. The second priority we'll cover in the next slide. But priority 3 is a project out to the McGregor industrial area. And if you remember a lot of the employment growth that was forecasted in that area, by the time we get to 2035 or 2040, we feel that there's probably going to be a need for some type of peak hour service out to the McGregor area that connects with the bus rapid transit line. Priority 2 is a realignment of all of Waco Transit's existing fixed routes to better connect with the bus rapid transit recommendation and the bus rapid transit alignment. The concept here are, instead of the 1-hour loops that the existing system uses, these routes would be 20 or 30-minute loops that then don't necessarily come all the way to downtown. They may only come to one of the outer stops. But the idea is when you combine this with the bus rapid transit system, you may have to make one more transfer point. However, we're going to get you from your origin to your destination much faster than what you're used to now. This priority actually includes all of the long-term operations for Waco Transit, since this is going to include all of Waco Transit's fixed routes, which is why we didn't include that in the categorical project that we mentioned earlier for Waco Transit operations. All right, so now we come to the point where we want to review some projects that scored very, very well in our project evaluation criteria, but for a number of reasons, we didn't feel comfortable recommending them at this time. Many of them are because the design may have controversial elements that we're not sure the public is ready or even willing to support, or we've actually heard opposition to the design concept through earlier efforts. In addition, the Loop 340 corridor has been proposed as a full freeway design. And while that design is very effective at moving traffic through that region, we've had some feedback that that isn't necessarily the design concept that folks are supportive of. And so we want to have some additional conversation about what ought to be the long-term design of the Loop 340 corridor, especially in the Belmead area and especially down towards Marlin Highway. In addition, that project is very, very expensive and would probably require resources beyond what would normally come to our region. So we want to have a conversation about that as well. But we would like to get your feedback on these projects as well as all the other recommendations that have been identified within our plan. So when we total up everything, we have $2.2 billion of expenses identified for the various projects within this plan. In other words, we're funding about half of what we've been asked to look at during our initial efforts this past spring. The thing I want to point out here is that more than half of the plan is in Strategy 1, which is our state of good repair strategy, which is primarily focused on maintaining the existing system in a good state of repair. So where do we go from here? We've begun a 45-day comment period. That comment period runs until January 7th. We do have a 10-day period at the end of that to give us some opportunity as staff to review what you've told us and to make appropriate changes to the recommendations, and also for us to be able to categorize and to better organize the comments that we've heard from you so that the policy board knows what you feel is appropriate or what you feel is inappropriate within this plan. We're going to have 4 public informational meetings as part of our process. The first of which is on Monday, December 9th at the Waco Multipurpose Center. Doors open at 5:30, and we'll have a formal presentation at 6. If you're not able to make that, Tuesday, December 10th is a second opportunity. This one in the afternoon. Doors open at 11:30. Formal presentation at 12 noon, and that's at the Waco Transit Administration facility. And after the New Year's holiday, there are 2 additional opportunities, both on Monday, January 6th. Both are at the Waco Transit Administration facility. One is at 11:30 a.m. with a 12 p.m. presentation, and then the second one at 5:30 p.m. with a 6 p.m. presentation. And then finally, we'll be adopting the MTP, or scheduled to adopt the MTP on Friday, January 17th, with a formal public hearing in advance, and that will be at 10 o'clock in the morning, and that location will be the South Waco Community Center, located at 2815 Spade. So, now's your opportunity. If you have questions, comments, ideas, we ask that you contact us. You can either call our main number at 254-750-5650. You can send us an email at mpo@wacotx.gov. Go to the City of Waco's Facebook page. But if you have some other method that works better for you in trying to contact us, we accept all methods regardless of how you get it to us. We just ask that we receive that before January 7th. If you go to our website, there will also be an opportunity identified on there where you can actually identify your 4 most important projects within the plan. And we encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. And we will be collecting up the scores to identify which projects received the most feedback from our citizens. And we'll be announcing that during the MPO Policy Board meeting on January 17th. So with that, we'd like to thank you for participating in this exercise. We certainly would like to hear back from you, especially for anything that you think is important in terms of these recommendations. If there are things that are missing from these recommendations, or if you've, especially if there are parts of these recommendations that you feel are not important and should not be moving forward. So we hope you have a great holiday season, and if you have any comments or questions, not only about this plan, or if you have concerns about the transportation system in general, we invite you to contact our staff at any time with the contact information that is on this slide. So with that, thank you, and we hope you have a great holiday.